Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, he's going to get into the Platform 2 building and we're going to see some results on that. Maybe not quite just yet. So before I can jump into the Platform 2 building and of course dealing with all the added complexity that wasn't in the outbuilding or the coals and lamps room that I'd previously done, I really do need to do a little bit of investigation, experimentation with how I'm actually going to nut out certain processes. So in today's episode, we're looking at the windows and how I'm going to assemble that, and basically the core wall structure. So how's that going to all work? How are we going to work with the interior detailing and all of those aspects? So this is quite a lengthy video, so I think without further ado, let's just jump into what I got up to. So obviously the first place to start is with a little bit of research and an investigation. So it's a case of going back to those original plans that we're able to get from the National Archive, and in particular, of course, the more detailed plan that actually has some dimensions and it shows the method of construction and how some of the elements within the building were designed. So obviously one of the most important aspects to this elevation is there's a bit of detail about the windows, and now that I'm moving on to the Platform 2 building, of course, it's got some windows, and of course the Platform 1 building is going to be even more complex. We're stepping up now really from the original, from the outbuilding that I started with, which of course had no windows. Now I think one of the most complex aspects to these windows and the doors is this upper section. So these sort of opening skylight windows that have got the curved or beveled corners to them, and the notch. It's going to be a bit complicated, particularly in the sense that the method I'm using obviously for the construction of these models is a brick printed texture that's wrapped. Now you'll recall from the outbuilding, of course, I wrapped the stonework inside the doorway, so that gave it that solid finish. So in terms of these windows, it's going to be a lot more complex because we've got bevels, we've got a beveled window sill on the exterior, and as I mentioned, this sort of unusual shape at the top. So looking at the photos on the left, of course, you can see the three sets of windows. That's the main sort of feature for the two end components of the building, and you can see how you could imagine this if that was wrapped and it was a printed texture wrapped, and of course doing curves and things like that, it becomes more of a challenge. And then of course the beveled windowsills in the lower part. Now fortunately those beveled windowsills is actually one solid block, it's not divided up, so that is going to be to my benefit. You also notice on the lower photo we've got a smaller bevel on the verticals, so that I may admit from the model, because I think by the time I scale that down it's going to be too small. Now looking at the lower half of this plan, we've got some cross sections, so we've got a side cross section and then we've got a plan view cross section of the windows, which is brilliant because it of course has the dimensions there that I can work from. So I've extracted out the two cross sections so I can look at them in more detail and obviously convert those measurements that are in there to metrics, and also scale them down so that I can get an understanding of what our scale dimensions are going to be. So you can see up there I've got metric 1:1, so that's what the metric conversion is for these imperial measurements, and then metric 00 scale, that's the equivalent dimensions they'll be in model form. So of course one of the first things that I wanted to ascertain is, well, how thick are the outer walls? So in scale terms, the thickness of the wall is 4.7 millimeters, so they are very thick walls. It's just shy of a 5 millimeter thick wall. So in some sense I could just use 5 millimeter MDF and that would be kind of close, but I'm not going to do that because I need to work out a way to incorporate the window frames, the window sashes. So in order to work out what would be the best thickness of material, I took a wee section up there and enlarged that up so I could actually divide it up into what the different thicknesses are within the wall section. So we've got the external window sill, that's 1.8 millimeters. We've got the actual window frame itself, the double hung window frame, 2 millimeters for that, and just shy of a millimeter for the inside window sill. So based on those dimensions, I think probably the best thickness material would be 2 lots of 2mm MDF. So my plan is that there will be a fully constructed outer shell in which the inner components or inner interiors are slotted into. Now if we factor in the printed texture that will wrap these components or wrap these MDF sections, that will add to the thickness of the overall wall, which would probably bring it out to around about 4.5 millimeters, which is not far off what the scale thickness of the wall would actually be. So looking at the vertical bevel, so that's just the small bevel, it's on the uprights of the stonework. It only works out at 0.7 of a millimeter, so it really is, it's not worth modeling, trying to model that. It is quite microscopic. But in terms of the sill bevel, so that's the 45-degree slope on the sill at the bottom, that is definitely worth modeling, and that works out to be around about 2 millimeters. Well, I'm going to make that section 2 millimeters thick, and if you look at a wee cross section I've got there that's exploded up on the left hand side, you can see there what my plan here is to create individual sills at the 45-degree angle, because as we know, I can't actually laser cut on a 45-degree angle. The laser cutter will only do a perpendicular or right angle cut. So the plan with that beveled sill is, using the caseboard, I can actually cut strips using my 45-degree bevel cutter, which of course is what picture framers use for cutting their bevel mounts, and I can cut entire strips of that and then cut them down into the appropriate sections. They can be pre-wrapped in the stone texture and then slotted into place. So going back to this detailed elevation, one of the aspects in here that doesn't appear true is the windows are divided into quarter panes, or at least the upper section has 2 panes and the lower section has 2 panes, relating obviously to this being double hung windows. Now I've gone through and scoured all the images of the station going back historically, and also the other stations on the line, and having a look at their windows, and there seems to be no case where the windows are actually divided in half or where it's quarter panes. They're just simply 2 panes of glass, the upper and the lower section. So as per the photo in the top right corner, clearly the windows have been replaced. These would have originally been double hung windows, and it looks like they've been swapped out for windows that hinge open. So armed with all this research and investigation, I think it's now time to actually put this into practice and see what we can develop. So I thought what I will actually do is actually just do a small mock-up of a section of wall with a window in it, and it's just purely to practice the theory or my plan for how these windows are going to take place, and actually have a go at wrapping the stonework and all of that kind of thing, and just see how it works and see how it looks. So it's not until I really get this sort of the window process and its assembly nailed down that I can actually move on to start developing the cut files for the Platform 2 building. So as you can imagine, I've started some of the experimentation with the laser cutter and the various materials, because I really did need to get this to a point where I can switch the camera on and actually start filming what's actually going on here. So we've got some components here that I've laser cut out of some 2mm MDF. So this is actually the exterior wall. Then we've got this interior inset wall, and then of course we've got the window frame. So one of the biggest hurdles that I really need to figure out, of course, is this beveled windowsill on the exterior. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm not going and doing the beveling around the actual verticals and the stonework because it's just too microscopic, but it would be nice to include the bevel in this lower part on the outside the windowsill that's significant enough for it to be a reasonably visible feature. So of course, in those plans that we went through just before, my thoughts were to using a 45-degree cutter, which is this wee device here, and actually cutting through some card material so I can slice through that, line up the ruler and cut through it and cut some strips off. Now, these are the strips here that I've cut off, so we get a strip like this, and I don't know whether this is going to show up terribly well, but it provides this 45-degree cut. Now, this is out of 2mm card, so this is not durable enough or suitable enough for me to actually cut a 45-degree through the 2mm MDF. It's just, the MDF is just too dense for that. Now, the only problem with using card is this is what you end up with. You end up with this. This is a 45-degree windowsill, and it's so microscopic. And by the time I try and position this in here, so you know, the idea is that you would slot this in here, it would be the same width as, of course, the cavity here. It starts to delaminate, the card goes all fluffy, it's just, it doesn't work. So 2mm card, out it goes, no good. So my next option was some 2mm balsa wood. Now, this is a reasonably light balsa, it's not a high density balsa, and of course this can cut through it very nicely. It actually does a beautiful cut, 45-degree cut through balsa wood. And then of course it was a case of getting these strips, and here's a strip that's then trimmed out with this 45-degree. It's possibly a bit hard to pick up, and then it was a case of cutting a strip the width of the window opening, so we just chop it through there, and then that is slotted in to that window frame like so, and glued into place. And I did try this on one and did a wrap, and it kind of works, but there's a certain amount of fragility with this in here, as you can see. So you've got that really basically glued to just a 2mm edge, and quite fiddly, and would be quite time consuming. Now you can see here I've made this is actually slightly proud of the wall, and the idea is that once it's glued and dried, you'd come along and you'd trim off that edge, and that would give you a nice flush edge here, which you would then do your brick wrap around, or in this case the stone texture would wrap on that windowsill. So that was the initial plan. Now that has since changed, and what I've actually found is probably, and this is a much easier way to go, is here's another wall section, and what I can actually see at the bottom here is that line that's underneath the window opening. That is just an engraved line, so that doesn't cut all the way through the material, but then the lines that are down the side, they go all the way through. So looking from the back, it kind of looks like that. Looks a bit funny, but what I've actually found is if I do that, and then using one of these types of knife blade, so it's a square ended knife blade, which is essentially like a chisel, and what I can actually do is line up the blade to where the groove is. So essentially the groove becomes a guide, and I can actually just carve that out. So in two sort of simple strokes, or if it hasn't quite gone right, we can just shave that angle down a bit and trim it down. Now some people might suggest that I use a a file to do this. Why not just use a file? The only problem with the file is that unless you're holding it absolutely dead straight, you end up with rounding, and the corners will round. You won't get that nice crisp sharp angle that this method here actually manages to achieve. So with that trimmed out, and hopefully that comes up on the camera, you can now see we have this beveled windowsill. So that is the solution for that part. So already in some respects those plans that we just went through, or the theoretical plans I should say, are already starting to go out the window, pardon the pun. So one of the other changes, since we're talking about changes to my theoretical plan, is this original plan here, and we'll go back to this one here where we were going to be gluing in individual sills on the outside, is we have the inner frame. So this is essentially the inner wall, so you could imagine the wall would extend out beyond this, and this was also cut from 2mm MDF, so you'd end up with this 4mm thick wall here. And then of course our window frame component then slots into this cavity, and then on top of that would be the clear glazing, in this case some clear acetate with computer cut vinyl on it, and we'll get into that shortly. So that was the original plan. Now I've actually ditched the second layer of this. Well, I haven't ditched this, but I've swapped it out for 1.4mm caseboard. So that's gone, and in comes 1.4mm caseboard instead. Now the reason I've done that is because what we're actually doing is we're putting in the caseboard, so that goes in there. This is actually kind of like an in-between layer. This layer here is actually not going to be seen at all. It's just purely for packing. So the frame then sits in there. We have our glazing and the computer cut vinyl cut frame, and then we have a, I would imagine this is probably about a 0.5 or 0.6 mil card, and this is the internal wall of the buildings or within the rooms themselves, and that is then going over the top. So we end up with 3 layers. So we've got our 0.6, 1.4, and then we've got our 2mm. So we sort of end up with the equivalent again of a 4mm thickness to the wall, then factoring in the wrapping of the texture that's going to be on this as well, and then of course the print that's actually going to be on the inside wall. So we'll actually finish this layer with a print, which of course will be the wall color. There's going to be the wooden paneling as well, which will run around each of the rooms. So one of the other aspects too that I needed to consider, so we go back to this one here, and of course what we'll do is I'll just finish doing this sill as well. We'll just chisel out that, on the appropriate angle. So we'll just trim that out. Is of course we've got these edges in here. Most of this will be hidden by the wrap texture, but of course there is going to be gaps where the texture will not wrap or cover, and also to improve the adhesion of the sticky label paper that's going to be wrapped around this, I thought it best to actually paint these inside edges. So there were a couple of ideas there as well. So initially I thought I would just do a whole batch of these lined up and spray paint them in a sandstone color. So the idea is that it would sort of blend into the wrapped stonework. Now I wasn't terribly happy with how that was coming out. It was a little bit sort of uneven, and then you get globs of spray paint as well. So what we're going to do is I've gone to a Tamiya color, and this is called medium grey, and it's actually quite a close match to the sandstone work. So the idea is I'm going to paint around all these edges in here to basically seal in the edges, but also it gives it the opportunity for this adhesive to stick, and also if there's any exposed edges in here that become apparent, they're less visible. So that's the idea behind that. So I'll go ahead and assemble some of these example walls, and of course I'll speed up the footage, but you should be able to get a reasonably good idea of how it's all going together and the methods that I'm using. So that's the test window and wall assembly complete. And of course you can see I've made 2 examples. Now there isn't much difference. The only very subtle difference, of course, is the outer window frame. So in one example the outer window frame is white, and in the other example it is a deep brick red burgundy colour. So the example with this outer frame in a deep brick red colour or burgundy colour, as I said, it's based on a little bit more research. So there's forever research in actually working with this model. Now I actually took a look at some further photos I found, and in particular some photos of the Barry Island station. Now to some degree there is a lot of similarities in the architecture. You can clearly see that there is inspiration, possibly even the same architect that was involved, although the Barry Island railway station is obviously on a slightly more grander scale. But one of the interesting things is that the outer frame on these windows is painted in a separate colour, and it's painted in a sort of a deep maroon burgundy colour. Now whether or not the reference about brick red is this particular colour, I'm not too sure. It seems a lot darker than what you would class as a normal brick red. However, the interesting aspect in some of these photos is how faded that colour is compared to other areas of the building. So where sunlight is beamed down, it has clearly dulled the original colour. So maybe that's where this brick red comes from, and the original paint colour is more of a deeper maroon. So another example potentially of this deep maroon colour is on the Vale of Glamorgan Railway, and this signal box. Now I believe the signal box is being restored. I think for quite some time it was disused and dilapidated, and once again this quite rich deep reddish brown colour is being used. That of course is then juxtapositioned against a very stark white colour. So in terms of just adding a little bit more interest to these models, I think I will go down the route of the outer window frame being in this burgundy. I think it just gives it that little bit more depth to the windows. So it's probably interesting to note in the photos that I showed of the Barry Island station, of course the windows there are in quarters, so they do actually have the vertical uprights between the upper and lower panes for each of the sash windows or double hung windows. So I think now that we've got this window structure and assembly process locked into place, we can actually now start to design and develop the Platform 2 building, and of course that will lead on to the main station building. So I guess with the Platform 2 building there will also be a little bit of experimentation in terms of the corners and really actually how the whole assembly takes place. So I'll leave it there for today's episode. I certainly hope you've gained some inspiration and ideas for your own layouts. Do take care, look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.